7 years of hell as described by the prophet Isaiah in chapter 34 of his book. Come near, Isaiah says, all ye nations to hear, and hearken ye peoples, let the earth hear, and all that is therein, the world and all things that come forth from it. For the indignation of the Lord is upon all nations, and his fury upon all their armies. He hath utterly destroyed them, he hath delivered them to the slaughter. Their slain also shall be cast out, and their stench shall come up out of their carcasses, and the mountains shall be melted with their blood. And all the host of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled together like a scroll. And all their host shall fall down as a leaf falleth from off the vine, and like a falling fig from the fig tree. What the Bible says about prophecy. And in these sessions we've been looking at future events, and some of them are exciting. We have studied the next great event in prophecy, the rapture of the church, and then the judgment seat of Christ, and then the greatest, grandest, and most glorious of all weddings, the wedding between Jesus Christ and the church. Those are glorious events. But now here's a very sobering study, that of the Great Tribulation, the 7-year period, a chronology of the tribulation. And what we have done in a previous study is divide these segments of events that will take place during the 7 years into 3 segments. Events that will transpire during the first 3.5 years, at least 5 things that will happen during the middle part, and then a number of things that will transpire during the last 3.5 years. In a previous session, we have examined at least 3 events during the first 3.5 years: the formal organization of the super harlot church, the appearance of the Antichrist and his false prophet, and the revival of the Roman Empire. We pick up our story now with event number 4, the Antichrist's 7-year covenant with Israel. Now, I am convinced the Antichrist will be from the Western world, and he will come into power pretending to be a benevolent world dictator and the friend of Israel. In other words, I do not think he'll come into power with a little name tag here that says, "Hello, my name is Antichrist. What's your name?" No, he will hide his true nature until the middle of the tribulation. But one of the things he will do, he will make a 7-year peace treaty with the nation Israel. And so you have his 7-year covenant with the nation Israel, and Isaiah calls this their covenant with death. And then number 5, the pouring out of the first 6 seal judgments. And these judgments will consist of cold war and famine and pestilence, anarchy, and heavenly disturbances. And I want to spend some time now on number 6, the mass return of the Jews to the land of Palestine. Ezekiel 37, I suppose, probably contains the most sensational, certainly one of the most famous visions in all the Bible. You remember, it's the vision of the valley of dry bones. And Ezekiel is set in the midst of a valley, and surrounding him are hundreds of thousands of bones. They're human bones, they're old bones, they've been there for many years, and God asked him a question. Ezekiel, can these bones live again? And Ezekiel gave a good Christian answer. He says, "Beats me, Lord." In essence, he said, "Lord, thou knowest. I have no idea, but you do." He said, "Ezekiel, prophesy upon these bones. Breathe upon them." And he did. And you remember that song sort of describes it best: the toe bone connected to the ankle bone connected to the knee bone connected to the thigh bone. Hear the words of the Lord. And he saw this great army. And they walked, they talked, and then the skeletons was covered with skin and muscle, and he saw an entire army, as it were. But he noticed one thing about this army. They walked, they talked, they moved, they had the appearance of life, but they were dead. There was no life in them. They were sort of like zombies. And God says, "Now, Ezekiel, this is what this means." He said, "I know what my people are saying. They're in captivity now. And in essence, they're saying God has forgotten His promises to Abraham and Isaac. We'll never be able to go back to the land of our forefathers. God said, yes, in the latter days, I will bring you back into the land. Now, we see the beginning of this prophecy fulfilled already. If you could have visited Palestine 150 years ago, you would have been hard-pressed to find 25,000 Jews in the entire Middle East. And that particular year, a century and a half ago, you could have easily found more Jewish people living in certain square block areas in New York City than in the entire Middle East. Well, that number has jumped somewhat, 150 years later, from 25,000 to over 4 million. Now, 1 out of 4 of the 16 million Jews worldwide, 25% are in the land of their forefathers. After World War I and II, they came back in an unprecedented return from 114 countries. Now, you have 1 out of 4, but I believe during the Great Tribulation, especially with the Antichrist 7-year covenant with Israel, that number will be increased from perhaps 1 out of 4 to 3 out of 4. So you have the mass return of the Jews to Palestine. Number 7, you have the conversion and call of the 144,000. Now, there are certain groups that say, well, that group refers to us, but these are Jewish Billy Sundays. These are Jewish Apostle Paul's, 12,000 from the 12 tribes that will be called by God at the beginning of the Great Tribulation. And then, one of the most remarkable events, the rebuilding of the Jewish temple. Actually, the rebuilding of the third temple. Now, when I say third temple, most of you will realize, well, that means there probably was a first temple and a second temple, and that's true. The first temple was built by Solomon about 1,000 years before Christ, and it was destroyed by the Babylonians 4 centuries later. And then they went back and rebuilt what became known as the second temple, and that was the temple that Jesus ministered in. But then the Romans destroyed that temple. Well, that happened in 70 A.D. That happened 2,000 years ago, and for the last 20 centuries, Jewish people have had no temple, but there's a white hot interest, as it were, in the land of Israel today, the rebuilding of what will become known as the third temple. And they're not doing it, but they're thinking about doing it. In fact, I have something here. You can't see it. I'll just hold it up, though. It's a little brochure. It's called The Treasures of the Temple Institute. And what this is, it's a little brochure you can purchase, and there's a building, a small building, near the Western Wall in the city of Jerusalem, given over to reproducing the artifacts that will be used in the building of the third temple, including the shofar, the menorah, and here's a mannequin with the dress of the high priest. There's harps, etc. Now, I've only had pictures here, but these are pictures of the actual things that have been created when the third temple goes up. So we know the third temple will be rebuilt because 2 Thessalonians 2 tells us that in the middle of the tribulation, the Antichrist will desecrate the third temple. And that's going to be pretty hard for him to do unless there is a temple. And we're also told in Revelation 11, John is instructed to measure the temple. And that'll be rather difficult to measure a non-existent temple. So it's not going up now, but there's a lot of interest in the rebuilding of the Jewish temple. And then number 10, these are events taking place, I believe, during the first 3.5 years, the possible rebuilding of the city of Babylon. I have something I want to read here, but before I read that, let me just say this. There are 2 chapters, well, actually 4 chapters in the Old Testament that refer to the destruction, not the rebuilding, the destruction of Babylon. These 2 chapters are Isaiah 13 and 14, Jeremiah 51 and 52. Now here's what the prophets prophesy, that Babylon, that great city, known only, second only in importance to Jerusalem, would someday be destroyed, that the destruction would be sudden, just a matter of a few hours, it would be supernatural, it would come from God Himself, and that it would be it would come from fire from heaven. In other words, Isaiah said God will destroy Babylon as He once destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah in the days of Abraham. Now that was a prophecy. The only problem with that prophecy, that hasn't been fulfilled. What happened to the Babylon of Daniel and the Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar? It was not destroyed. It sort of just crumbled away, just sort of faded away like the old soldier. So you got one of 2 possibilities. Isaiah and Jeremiah were wrong. Oh, that's certainly not a possibility. Or the other possibility is that Babylon is going to be rebuilt. And during the rebuilding of the city of Babylon, and I believe it will become the headquarters of the Antichrist on the Euphrates River there, then God will destroy Babylon. I have a quote here from a book written by Dr. Charles Dyer, and it's called The Rebuilding of Babylon. Dr. Dyer is a professor at Dallas Seminary. Here's what he says. It is a cloudless September summer night, and the moon casts its shining image on the banks of the gentle Euphrates River. Thousands of guests and dignitaries walk by torchlight to Babylon's Procession Street and enter the city from the north. Instructed to line the streets among the massive walls, the guests obediently follow orders. When the audience is in place, the dark-eyed man in charge nods, and the procession begins. The dark-eyed man, by the way, is a very interesting character. Rows and rows of soldiers parade in, dressed in Babylonian tunics and carrying swords, spears, and shields. Interspersed among the ranks of soldiers are groups of musicians playing harps, horns, and drums. Clusters of children carry palm branches, and runners bear bowls of incense. Then come soldiers and still more soldiers in a seemingly endless line of men and weapons. After the procession, the guests attend a ceremony paying tribute to Ishtar, the mother goddess of Babylon. Question, Dyer says, have I just described a scene of pagan worship from the time of Daniel? Perhaps. But it is also exactly what I witnessed when I returned to Babylon in 1988 for the second International Babylon Festival held under the patronage of this dark-eyed man in charge, Saddam Hussein. And the article goes on to say, by the end of 1990, that was many years ago, Saddam Hussein had spent nearly $500 million, that's over $1 billion today, I'm told, on restoring ancient Babylon. Over 100 million bricks have been laid, and many buildings are now in place, including the Marduk Gate, Greek Theater, the Hammurabi Museum, Nebuchadnezzar's Museum, Ishtar Temple, etc. And I'm suggesting to you, the evidence, if not overwhelming, is certainly indicative of the fact that during the middle of the tribulation, Babylon will be, perhaps at the beginning, will be rebuilt. So you have these 10 events, and now during the middle part, the Gog and Magog invasion into Palestine. Right after Ezekiel wrote chapter 37 about the Valley of Dry Bones, God says, now wait a minute, I'm not through. There's a couple more chapters here before you put down your pen and pencil. You write concerning what I'm going to tell you about an invasion that will take place perhaps during the middle of the tribulation. And he says, and Ezekiel says, that as told by the Lord, that sometime during the Great Tribulation, a nation, in the Hebrew it's located in the utter northern parts from Israel, will invade what God calls the Promised Land, or in this case, the Glorious Land. And the name of this nation and the land that God talks about, this invasion, is Gog, G-O-G, of the land of Magog. Now, for many years, believers, at least a lot of believers, have held the theory that Gog of the land of Magog is actually a reference to Russia. And this seems to be very, very plausible, but something very strange happened the day after Christmas, on a Thursday, December the 26th, 1991. Because on that day, for the first time in recorded history, are you ready for this? Shrimp learned to whistle. Well, what do you think we mean by that? Now, if you're an old fogey like me, I remember in the 50s and early 60s watching television. On one occasion, Nikita Khrushchev, who was the premier of Russia, came to the United Nations, made a speech, whipped off his shoe, and began to pound it on the podium there of the United Nations, and said, you out there in the Western world, you're waiting for communism to collapse? We Russians have a proverb. You'll have to wait till shrimp learn to whistle. Well, Mr. Khrushchev, on Thursday, December the 26th, 1991, shrimp learned to whistle. We all know what happened. The Soviet Empire collapsed, and you have 15 different providences. Well, does that mean now that the Soviet Empire, because it's gone, the USSR, that we have to find another candidate for Gog and Magog? May I read just another article here from a friend of mine who has a Ph.D. from Dallas Seminary, and he's pastoring a church, Dr. Mark Hitchcock, and he has written a book, After the Empire, and this is what he writes. The Soviet Empire has ended, but a new empire seems to be rising from its ashes. The new empire is not the new Commonwealth or even Russia. The new empire is the great Islamic wave. Now listen, this is incredible what he says. Amazing events are occurring in our world today, especially the Muslim world, even as these words are being written. Never before in history have world events changed more suddenly or dramatically from the perspective of Bible prophecy. Never have so many biblically relevant factors converged more clearly. The southern republics of the former Soviet Empire, all closest to Israel, are all Muslim nations except the Ukraine, Armenia, and Georgia. These Muslim nations make up some 25% of the population of the old Soviet Union, a total population of over 60 million. This is what he says now. These newly independent nations have three things in common. First, as already noted, they are all Muslim. Second, they all lack hard currency. Third, they all have nuclear weapons within their boundaries and at their disposal. These three factors are obviously a dangerous combination. The scenario seems clear. These six members could conspire with their Islamic brothers in Iran, Syria, Pakistan, Libya, and Turkey to exchange nuclear devices for hard currency. Now, one final statement here, and this is the clincher here. The common bond, however, that binds them all together is their undying hatred and commitment to destroy Israel. In other words, what we're saying that with the collapse of the Soviet Empire, the communists, and they didn't like the Jews, they didn't like anybody, but they only had 74 years, the communists, to perfect their hatred from 1917 to 1991. The Muslims have had thousands of years, and what we're saying, this may even provide a more dangerous situation, the Muslims as opposed to the communists. And so at any rate, you have the Gog and Magog invasion into Palestine, and then you have the martyrdom of two special witnesses. I wish we had time to talk about this, but let me just say that it could be said the strangest and most unusual funeral to be held in the history of the world can be read about in Revelation chapter 11. And it is a funeral of these two witnesses. Now, Revelation 11 begins by saying that during the first part of the Great Tribulation, God said, I will give power to my two witnesses, and they will minister for 3.5 years. And for 3.5 years, these two Bible champions will be bones in the throat of the Antichrist. You won't be able to swallow them. But at the end of the 3.5 years, God, under God's sovereign will, the Antichrist will be allowed to kill them. And their dead bodies will lie in the streets of Jerusalem for 3.5 days, and then during their funeral, or it'll be a ridicule-type funeral, their bodies will be raised and they will be caught up to meet the Lord in the air. Now, who are these two witnesses? And I'm convinced the identity of one being Elijah, because the last chapter of the last book in the Old Testament is Malachi chapter 4. And this predicts in the last days Elijah the prophet will come back to planet Earth. And I'm pretty well convinced his helper will be Moses, based on the fact that in Matthew chapter 17, it is Elijah and Moses that appeared to Jesus, and they talk with him on the Mount of Transfiguration. So you have the ministry and then the martyrdom of these two wonderful men. And then the possible martyrdom of the 144,000. I don't know what happens to them. They just sort of disappear. And then the casting out of Satan from heaven. Now, if you've ever watched comics or comedians on TV, and The Devil Made Me Do It, or Walt Disney comic books, we have an idea that Satan is dressed in a long flannel pair of red underwear. He has two horns and a tail, and he's pitching coal in the furnace of hell with a pitchfork. Now, as I said concerning something else, my friends, you will find that description of Satan in the Bible in the same chapter that talks about Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. The truth of the matter is Satan still has access to God himself. And during, apparently, the middle part of the Great Tribulation, Satan will be cast out of the heavenlies, and he will come down, and his sphere of influence will be limited to planet Earth. See, he now is the accuser of the brethren. I want to tell you something. I don't know what time you got to bed last night, and I don't know what time you got up this morning, but I want to tell you one thing. Satan didn't go to bed last night, and he didn't have to get up this morning. And you know what he did all last night? Same thing he's doing all day today. He's slandering all Christians at the right hand of the Father. That's one of the reasons Jesus had to ascend, to counteract the lies of the devil. Okay? But during the middle of the tribulation, old Slewfoot, as it were, is cast out, and he comes down on planet Earth. He has great wrath. You know why? He says, the Bible says, because he knows he has but a short time. How does he know that he has a short time? One day when the devil didn't have anything else to do, he'd read Playboy, Penthouse, Hustler, all those wonderful magazines. He decided, you know, I think I'll read the Bible, just find out what my enemy's up to these days. Well, he read Daniel 9, and if we can understand, Satan can too, he's evil, but he's not stupid, that the tribulation lasts for 7 years, and 3.5 have gone by, and the Antichrist is really not taking over as he wanted, so he comes down. And then, number 5, during the middle part, one of the most ironic moments in all the history of the world, the destruction of the false church. Not the fact of the destruction, but the source. Now, who destroys a false church? Let me tell you who does. Billy Graham doesn't, and D.L. Mooney doesn't, the Apostle Paul doesn't, Gabriel doesn't, the Father doesn't, the Son doesn't, the Holy Spirit doesn't. You know who destroys a false church? The Antichrist himself. Apparently she tries to control him, and he destroys her. And then the last 3.5 years, the full manifestation of the Antichrist. Apparently during the middle of the tribulation, he allows a statue to be built of him, and this statue is then wheeled into the Holy of Holies, and the statue speaks. And in essence, the statue says, you know, for the last 3.5 years, I have allowed you, Gentiles, to look upon me as the great world leader, and I am that, and you Jewish people to look upon me as a benevolent friend of Israel, and I am that. But I am God, and you must fall down and worship me as God and receive my mark, the mark 666, on your forehead or your arm, in order to buy or sell or marry or divorce, take a job, quit a job. And from that point on, I mean, it's been bad during the first 3.5 years, but now all hell itself will break loose. The full manifestation of the Antichrist. And then the worldwide persecution of Israel. Zechariah indicates 2/3 of the Jewish people will die. Now, 16, 17, 18 million Jews today. Hitler killed 6, and that'll mean probably 12 or 13 million that will die during that terrible time. And then you have the message of 3, the pouring out of the last seal judgment, and that consists of a number of trumpets. You have the messages of 3 special angels concerning imminent doom and destruction. You have the sudden destruction of economic and political Babylon, and I believe that'll happen in Revelation 18 as Isaiah predicted. The fire will come from heaven and destroy future political, economic Babylon located on the banks of the Euphrates River. And then the battle of Armageddon, the bloodiest, the most brazen, the most blasphemous of all battles, and the size of this incredible. In the north, it begins at Megiddo and all the way south to Edom, a total of 200 miles. The west part is the Mediterranean. The east is Jordan, and that will be 100 miles. Now, if you multiply 200 north to south times 100 west to east, you get 20,000 square miles. And tens of millions or hundreds of millions of men will meet in that area there to do battle under the Antichrist's leadership with the city of Jerusalem. But at that moment, and we'll be talking about this in the next session, the greatest, most grand, the most glorious of all moments in the history of the world, at the sounding of the 7th trumpet, and the kingdoms of this world will become the kingdoms of our God and of His Christ, and we shall reign forever. The Savior Himself comes from heaven, makes a perfect 2-point landing on the Mount of Olives, and destroys the devil at the battle of Armageddon.